Middle East, a modern name for a region shaped by millennia of conflict and faith. From the Crusades to the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire, its history is marked by sacred visions and imperial designs. And we understand its present shape by studying its layered past. I'm Paul Lay, and I'm delighted to welcome today Martin Goodman, Professor Emeritus of Jewish Studies at the University of Oxford, and a man who's produced several highly acclaimed books, not least one of my favourites, Rome and Jerusalem, which is particularly pertinent to the conversation we're having today, which is about the Jewish roots of Christianity. It's an obvious fact, it's a well-known fact that Jesus was a Jew, but it's sometimes neglected, the importance of that and the importance of Judaism to that historical figure. I wonder if you could paint a portrait, a picture of both that historical Jesus, what we know of him, but also the milieu in which he was raised and from which his ideology, his religion was rooted.
So we know about the life of Jesus from the canonical Gospels. In antiquity, there were many versions of the life of Jesus, but the four which end up in the New Testament more or less agree as to how he was born and how he preached his and where he taught, and of course about, in the end, his crucifixion. And they all place him in Galilee for his childhood, and then primarily in the city of Jerusalem as the main place where he taught, which was the center of Jewish life in the time of Jesus. And about that we know a huge amount. Jerusalem was the center of Jewish life because that was where the Jewish temple stood, which, according to the Bible, was the one place where Jews thought that they should worship God with sacrifices and with offerings. It was a huge building, precisely because Jews had just the one temple, whereas other religions in their day had lots of temples, so they divided up their money for different temples. This was just the one place, so it was very large and very impressive. And that was the center of Jewish life and was also the center for the teaching of Jesus and for his career. We also know a good deal about the variety of expressions of Judaism in the time of Jesus, not least through the discovery in the 1940s of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
And that paints a really quite vivid portrait of the range of beliefs that Jews had.
Yes. So all Jews started with the Bible, which got to its present form by round about the 2nd century BCE, so 200 years or so before the birth of Jesus. But having a written text meant that Jews agreed more about the nature of God and about how he should be worshipped than was the case for other religions, where there was no written text telling you what to think or what to do. But it didn't stop there being a huge amount of disagreement in how to interpret that text. And that's where the varieties of Judaism came in.
And how is Jesus himself rooted there? What are the influences on him? I mean, this is a very difficult thing, I imagine, to really be concrete about that stuff. But what do you think are the beliefs that are intrinsic to Judaism or are part of that culture of that time that shape him?
Well, what made Judaism distinct was that there was a Bible, and that the Bible laid down both instructions on how to worship, but also instructions on how to live a moral life. And that moral life comes out of the biblical text, and comes, in both cases, through divine inspiration. That's the whole notion behind these laws. And so that combination of morality and religious piety coming out of the same text was a distinctive element within Judaism compared to other religious systems of the day. And Jesus will have shared that. Beyond that, which of the different groups of Judaism he felt closest to? The answer is bits of almost all of them will have been reasonably attractive to him. He will have had some things in common with Pharisees. He may well have had something in common with Essenes. And certainly his followers, at least, will have had something in common with those Jews who thought that the end of the days might be coming quite soon.
So there's an eschatological background to this as well, which is very Christian as well.
Indeed. So yes, an expectation that the end of days would come at some point was widespread. People didn't know what it meant, but they thought something was going to happen at some time.
So what was the nature of the Jewish population's relationship with Rome?
So the Jews had been, Jerusalem had been conquered by the Roman general Pompey in 63 BCE. And that was a bad start, really. Pompey claimed that he was conquering Jerusalem on behalf of one of two brothers who wanted to be high priest. So he was simply intervening on behalf of a local ruler, which was the standard Roman procedure when they wanted to conquer places. But on conquering Jerusalem, he went into the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem, where, according to the Jewish law, only the high priest should go once a year after considerable purifications. So it was a huge desecration to start off with. Pompey went in because he believed, he had been told, that there was nothing there, that it was an empty space. So he went out of curiosity. Of course, it was an empty space. That was the whole point of the Holy of Holies. But Jews remembered him as a wicked person, and they, centuries later, they were going to desecrate his tomb in Alexandria in Egypt. So some Romans were definitely not liked by Jews, but in many respects, direct Roman rule involved quite a light touch from the Roman state in Jesus' time. So not a large garrison of Roman troops. What they did was, when they intervened, they did so brutally.
But that was true of everywhere the Romans were.
Yes, that was the standard Roman method. They were controlling an absolutely huge empire, and they had to do that either through the agreement of local elites who would support them because it was in their interests, or sometimes both and, through violent repression whenever they had any kind of opposition. So for much of the life of Jesus, there appears to have been little unrest within Jews under Roman rule. So the classic statement of this was by the Roman senator Tacitus, writing his histories of the Roman world. And what he wrote about Judea under Roman rule was under Tiberius, which is the emperor who ruled from 14 down to 37 CE.
So this is the emperor who's there when Christ is crucified?
Absolutely, yes. Under Tiberius, quies in Latin, which means quiet. Nothing happened. So from the point of view of a Roman aristocrat, it was total.
It was a non-event.
It was a non-event, yes, and which is sobering. So it's a question of perspective. So clearly, if you were involved in these events, they were dramatic, but from outside, not.
They were largely forgotten.
Yeah.
And who was the point of contact? Who would be the point of contact between the Jewish people there and the Roman rulers, the governors?
So the main point of contact were the high priests and their supporters, they're often members of their family, within the temple. So Jerusalem was unusual as a city within the Roman world, of being a quite substantial city, but that was entirely focused on this great temple, which had been rebuilt by King Herod as a client king of the Romans, who died just before the birth of Jesus. And the temple as an institution dominated the city. Still the case, of course, if you go to Jerusalem, that the site of the temple, which is now the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Golden Dome, that site still dominates the city, and that had been built up just before the birth of Jesus.
And what was the attitude of the Romans towards the Jewish population?
So the Romans thought some Jewish customs were very strange. They were not shy about saying so.
Yes.
So we have remarks about from Seneca about the laziness of Jews, knocking off work every seventh day. They lose a seventh of their life in idleness. They found circumcision funny. They found the Jewish insistence on only worshipping the God of the Jews and not worshipping other gods really strange. Because if you're a polytheist, as all Romans were otherwise, then it is obvious that it is sensible to worship the other gods, because otherwise there's not going to be divine favor will not be available to you. So they found the Jews very odd, but they had plenty of other very odd peoples that they ruled over who had different customs from Roman customs, and it's characteristic of Roman rule to allow these customs to continue, provided they don't interfere with the main Roman needs of keeping control and ensuring that taxes bring in an income. So they allowed the Jews these strange habits on the grounds that these were ancestral customs.
And this strange habit of monotheism is one of the legacies that Judaism has given Christianity. I wonder if you could give us some sense in the way in which Christianity is shaped by Judaism.
Yes, it's less monotheism than monolatry, meaning the insistence on worshipping just the one God. So Jews, like early Christians, assumed that there were other sort of forces in the world. And of course you get that in the gospel accounts. And
early Christians were Jews, of course.
Indeed. But you get in the gospel accounts of demons. That invade somebody when they're mentally ill. So the whole idea that there are other forces around, that both Jews and early Christians within Judaism and outside Judaism, in both cases, they assumed that was the case. But that the God of the Jews is a jealous God, as it says in the Ten Commandments. You must not go worshipping other gods, otherwise I will get very cross. So that's what made them distinctive, and that is what is perhaps the most important thing actually in the early church that is inherited by all Christians. So our earliest Christian texts. Not the Gospels, which of course must have come from earlier traditions about the life of Jesus, but they're the letters of Paul.
Who is a crucial figure in the early Christianity, the crucial figure in many ways.
Very much so, a really important figure. And he based his teaching hardly at all on the life of Jesus, or indeed the teachings of Jesus. So when he came up with moral teachings, he tended to give them in his own name on the basis of his own calling on the road to Damascus, which was, of course, after the death and crucifixion of Jesus. So the resurrected Christ had spoken to him, and that's what gave him the authority to speak. So he didn't go back to what Jesus himself had actually said, in the way that later Christians were to do from the Gospels.
And there's tremendous energy about Paul, isn't there, in terms of his...
Well, Paul was energetic, not least because he thought the end of the world was coming tomorrow.
And that's the other crucial legacy, I suppose.
Very much so. I mean, he was much more energetic than other Jews, or indeed other Christians. So he's clearly Paul was a Jew, as we can tell from his willingness to undergo punishment at the hand of Jewish courts, which, particularly if he was a Roman citizen, which we're told in the Acts of the Apostles, he can only have done if he put himself voluntarily under the jurisdiction of those courts. Otherwise, the Jewish courts would have got into serious trouble with the Roman governors of the cities where Paul was teaching, if they were going to punish a Roman citizen with the 39 stripes, which is serious beating, without permission from the Roman state. So it must be voluntary, and it must be very important to him that he was Jewish, and indeed he talks about it a lot. But his followers were, his new churches, his new communities, were not Jews. And they were being, he was calling them to a new faith without expecting them to become Jewish as well.
Where were those, who were those non-Jewish early Christians? Where did they come from? What ethnicity were they? What background are they?
So we have these early communities in northern Syria and in Asia Minor, Anatolia. So in places like Ephesus and Corinth and all the places that
he wrote letters.
He wrote letters to, yeah. So these are local Greeks. They see themselves as Greeks. They are people whose families, their backgrounds had been assumed that they were going worshipping the local gods.
Yeah, yeah.
And so the reason for Paul getting into trouble with the civic authorities lay in his insistence that these new converts of his to his new faith should stop worshipping the pagan gods. So it's not so much the positive things that he was saying, which they were difficult to see why anybody would object to. It was the negative thing.
Yeah.
And indeed, when Christians get martyred in the next following centuries, it is always their failure to worship rather than the stories.
Yeah.
There were stories.
So it's not their narrative, it's what they're neglecting.
Yes, yeah. Yes. And that, of course, is something that comes straight out of the Jewish background. Yeah. The difference being that in the case of these Gentile Christians, in the eyes of Romans, and indeed their fellow Greeks, they couldn't justify it on the basis of ancestral tradition, because they were moving away from their ancestral tradition.
And there is, from a secular viewpoint at least, regardless of one's religion, an awful lot of contingency in this story, which, when you mentioned Tacitus earlier, that idea that it was of no importance what became a major world religion, and its origins were neglected, if not ignored. And what is it about Christianity that made it so successful in terms of it becoming a mass religion?
It would be nice to know. So it was sufficiently remarkable for Christians in the first 4 centuries to write about the spread of the church as a miracle. I mean, it was very surprising. And in many respects, they're right. It's very surprising. This is a religious, new religion that spread across the Roman world and indeed further east into other parts of the Near East. And it spread despite the fact that it started with an extraordinarily unpromising premise of a founder who had been crucified by the Roman state.
Which is a very humiliating punishment.
It's a terrible punishment. It's a terrible punishment, and one that the people to whom the new faith was being spread would understand. I mean, of course, we are too accustomed to seeing sort of pictures in church of crucifixions as if they're sort of normal. It's not. It's totally horrible. So it's a very strange way of starting. You wouldn't start from here if you want to start a new religion. And I think even stronger than that, it was a new religious system that spent more than 300 years trying to work out what it thought. So the development of Christian doctrines involved the denial of those doctrines which the mainstream was eventually to decide were orthodox and acceptable, by creating the whole notion of heresy.
Yeah.
So the very word heresy, or heresis in Greek, in the first century, in normal use in Greek writers, means a choice. That's its technical meaning. And it means a philosophical choice. Or it can mean, in the case of Jews, it can mean a religious choice. Not a bad one. But by the second century, we have Christian writers writing against heresies, meaning all those who had made the wrong choice. And there were a lot of them. So the notion that there was a sort of a straight evolution of Christian doctrine is patently not the case.
And can you give us some examples of those corrections, if we might call them?
Well, the clearest one, because it involved attitudes towards Judaism, was from the mid-2nd century CE. So Marcion, a really quite major figure in the Roman Church, preached that what Christians, or who Christians should be worshipping, was the God worshipped by Paul, that's to say the Saviour God, and they should decline to worship, they should refuse to worship the Creator God who was behind the Old Testament. And they were, there was a sort of logic to it, that this was a brand new, different kind of religious system. That was really problematic, because both Paul and indeed in the Gospels, so the Gospel writers, had looked to the Old Testament for the prophecies that were fulfilled in the life of Jesus. So you could see that it wasn't that easy just to reject the whole of the Old Testament as nothing to do with us.
Yeah, of course.
And the solution, which of course has been very powerful, was to look for symbolic, allegorical ways of interpreting the Old Testament text. Meaning, it doesn't mean what it says. It means that's what allegory is. It means when I say A, I mean B. And you can do that indefinitely.
Yes.
And indeed, that's what Christian writers were to do as a way of keeping the Old Testament text and using the prophecies when they wanted to, while not having to insist on male Christians having to undergo circumcision or to keep the food laws as laid down in the Hebrew Bible.
And of course, Rome plays a crucial aspect in the success of Christianity as well, in it becoming a mass religion.
Yes, the point it became a mass religion is difficult to pin down. It's difficult because already in the first century, there were Christians who say it's fantastic. The faith has spread to the end of the earth. And Paul is already sort of talking along those lines. But there weren't very many Christians doing the spreading. It was archaeologically, the spread of Christianity is more or less invisible until well into the 3rd century. So there are very few buildings or monuments which you can identify as having been produced by Christians anywhere within the Christian world. It doesn't mean they weren't there, but they didn't leave a great mark. One of the major impulses for people to join the church is likely to have been the martyrdom of those who stood up against the Roman state in the 250s and in the late 290s and early 300s, when the Roman state insisted that all its subjects should worship the pagan gods on behalf of the Roman emperor and on behalf of the state. And martyrdom, as people noticed at the time, or more importantly, stories about martyrdom, were a really effective form of propaganda. So you could tell that these Christians really meant what they were doing if they were prepared to die for it. But we still don't know how many Christians there really were until the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine. And he converted not because of the power of ideas, but because he believed that the Christian God had appeared to him on his side, sent him a sign. We have different versions of the sign, but he thought he'd been sent a sign under which he had won in a civil war. And so that became his, Christ became the God who would help him to keep his power, and he really meant it.
Which again emphasises contingency.
Yes, very much so. I mean, it's very powerful once you get the resources of the state behind the really well-organised Christian communities. So that's important, that even if there weren't many Christians in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, it's clear that they were organised into hierarchies, into communities for each city, and they wrote to each other. This appears to be unique. I don't think we have any other examples in the Roman world of a religious community in which ideas are sent from one community to another with letters going across the Mediterranean, where the postal system operated comparatively well because of the peace imposed by the Roman state. And so they were very organized. And that meant that once Constantine started to send resources to Christian communities, the communities were organized enough to be able to use those resources effectively. So I think that might be one of the reasons why eventually you end up with mass adoption of Christianity.
Let me ask you one final question, Martin, which it's become a kind of orthodoxy in recent years that I think it's implicit in the work of Peter Brown as well, but more popular with Tom Holland and people like Larry Siedentop and thinkers like that, that Christianity is in some sense a forerunner of liberalism. They often quote St. Paul, his idea, there are no Jews, there are no Gentiles, there is no male, there is no female. What are your thoughts on that?
Everybody is equal, provided they all agree with me. So that was the underlying idea behind it, and indeed the idea for Paul. So not saying that these distinctions don't matter. No, there are going to be slaves in Christendom, and indeed male and female in Christendom. So no, that's not going to come to an end. But so I think that the notion that these are in themselves liberal ideas is optimistic. And not least because of this whole process of defining out heresy, which was so early within the growth of the Christian Church. And it was effective doing so, but they had to be quite tough. And there were practical reasons also why you might want to define out some forms of heresy. Those forms of sort of Christian thought that we know from both attacks against heresies within the mainstream, from the mainstream, and from papyri and other documents found in Egypt, reveal types of Gnostic Christianity which, to the mainstream, were themselves bizarre and involved the kind of misbehavior that brought Christians into disrepute. So you can see the problem, that if you didn't have a strong hierarchy, the exact opposite, actually, of liberalism, if you didn't have a strong hierarchy with clear ideas as to what was acceptable, then all Christians were going to be in trouble in a pagan state in which they were already on thin ice because they were unwilling to worship the pagan gods.
Fascinating. Thank you, Martin Goodman.
Thank you.